Gold, it dazzles, it tempts, and it defines empires. But in the heart of West Africa, gold was never merely a precious metal, it was something deeper, more sacred. This was ancient Ghana, not the modern nation-state, but the broader region that once cradled powerful kingdoms, each rooted in the fertility of the land and the glitter of its soil. Their techniques were advanced, their craftsmanship meticulous. Gold wasn't just used for trade. It was woven into every corner of life. It graced the necks and wrists of royalty, but also conveyed stories and wisdom through tiny gold weights carved with symbols representing proverbs and values. They built a capital, Kumasi, that was sophisticated, bustling, and adorned with splendor. Their armies were disciplined, their government centralized and highly effective. They mastered diplomacy and warfare, trading with Europeans while fiercely protecting their sovereignty. At the center of all this was their gold, the medium through which they gained allies, deterred enemies, and solidified their internal structure. It's about how one people refused to be reduced to a footnote in colonial archives. We will uncover how this golden empire rose, why it resisted, and what it still represents in today's world. It is the story of resilience. Welcome to the world of the Ashanti. Because to speak of the Ashanti is to speak not just of an African kingdom, but of a golden flame, one that burned against conquest, that dazzled through oppression, and that continues to glow through generations, and instead carved their place in the larger narrative of world history with shimmering brilliance and fierce pride. Every piece had a meaning. Every glimmer had a message. The British, in particular, sought control of the region's gold and trade routes. In 1900, a British governor made the fatal mistake of demanding the Golden Stool, the sacred symbol of the Ashanti soul, be brought to him. The Ashanti refused. But more than that, a woman rose. Yaa Asantewaa, the queen mother of Ejisu, defied both colonial arrogance and gender norms to lead an armed rebellion against British forces. If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. Her leadership in this final stand became legendary, not just in Ghana, but across Africa and the diaspora. What followed was a series of brutal wars spanning nearly a century, wars in which the Ashanti fought valiantly, again and again, against the encroachment of empire. The British exiled their leaders and looted their treasures, but the soul of the Ashanti, enshrined in the Golden Stool, preserved in their proverbs, hidden in their songs, endured. Their monarchy remained, not just as a ceremonial relic, but as a symbol of continuity. Even today, the Asanahin, the Ashanti king, commands respect both within Ghana and abroad, not as a ruler of a fallen kingdom, but as the custodian of an unshakable heritage. From the First Anglo-Ashanti War in 1823 to the final blow in 1901, they resisted not just with weapons, but with unshakable identity. In these lush regions, where dense canopies stretch above red earth, gold shimmered beneath rivers and inside mountains, as if hidden by the ancestors themselves. The people who would become the Ashanti were born into this inheritance, one both blessed and burdened by its brilliance. For the Ashanti people of Ghana, gold wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It was the heartbeat of their civilization, the vessel of their spiritual identity, and the shield of their resistance against colonial domination. It adorned their kings, sealed their pacts, decorated their temples, and even spoke their wisdom through intricate weights and symbols. To understand the Ashanti is to understand their gold, not as currency, but as soul. West Africa is a land layered in time and treasure, and nestled in its rich forest belt lies a region that has for centuries drawn the attention of traders, empires, and conquerors alike. Long before Europeans arrived, long before the Atlantic slave trade would scar the continent, The Akan-speaking peoples of this land, including the Ashanti, were already mining, trading, and crafting gold. But the Ashanti story is not just one of wealth. It is a story of rising power, calculated unity, and fiery resistance. In the late 1600s, when rival clans and states jostled for dominance in the forest belt of modern-day Ghana, a visionary named Osei Tutu emerged. Alongside his spiritual advisor, Komfo Anokye, Osei Tutu united disparate Akan states into one formidable empire, the Ashanti. The source of their unity was not just political strategy, but something deeply spiritual, the Golden Stool. Said to have descended from the heavens, the Golden Stool did not seat a king, it housed the soul of the Ashanti nation. It became the sacred heart of the empire, the untouchable emblem of collective identity. With gold as their economic lifeline and the Golden Stool as their spiritual compass, the Ashanti rose to become one of the most powerful and organized states in pre-colonial Africa. However, as European ambitions shifted from coastal trading to inland conquest, the Ashanti's wealth became both a magnet and a threat. And then came the defining moment of Ashanti resistance, the War of the Golden Stool. Though the Ashanti were eventually subdued by force, they were never broken in spirit. The story of the Ashanti is not just about gold. It's about how that gold became a mirror of human dignity, sovereignty, and resistance. In this documentary, we journey through time, from the sacred forests of ancient Ghana to the royal courts of Kumasi. From battles against British rifles to modern calls for the return of looted Ashanti treasures. This is not just the story of riches. Long before gold adorned the crowns of European kings or lit up the treasuries of foreign empires, it glistened beneath the soil of West Africa, silently, abundantly, and powerfully. Nowhere was this presence more pronounced than in the thick forest zones of what is today southern Ghana, the heartland of the Ashanti. This region, blanketed with lush green canopies, winding rivers, and red earth, was more than fertile. It was mystical. As early as the 10th century, Arab traders had documented the flow of gold from West Africa, calling the region the Land of Gold. Trans-Saharan caravans carried the precious metal northward, traded for salt, cloth, and other goods. Gold became far more than an economic commodity. It was the pulse of political, spiritual, and social life. Among the Ashanti, gold was a sacred element, the physical embodiment of power, purity, and the divine. It didn't just symbolize status, it authenticated it. Kings wore it not to dazzle but to declare their connection to the heavens. The use of such weights required not only literacy in commerce, but literacy in meaning. Europeans came seeking gold and were stunned to find it flowing so freely in Ashanti lands. They documented the opulence they saw: golden swords, golden slippers, golden crowns, even golden stools for commoners of rank. Ashanti gold weights are preserved in museums across the world, often without their stories. It reminds us of a civilization that knew its worth long before the world came knocking. They shaped the destiny of their region and echoed through the corridors of world history. It tells the story of a people who understood how to extract beauty from the ground and meaning from metal. And it stands as a glittering testament to the fact that African history is not a tale of scarcity and dependence, but of richness, resilience, and genius. Sacred gold artifacts looted during colonial incursions are still on display in London, Amsterdam, and Paris, prompting ongoing calls for repatriation. And in the royal court of the Ashanti king, the Assanehene, gold still flows as both regalia and relic, linking the modern-day kingdom to its ancient soul. What they didn't always understand, however, was the reverence behind these objects. To them, gold was wealth. To the Ashanti, gold was truth. To be an Ashanti trader was to be fluent in both mathematics and metaphor. They understood their land made them powerful and vulnerable. As coastal tribes formed trading relationships with European powers, internal rivalries sharpened. The Ashanti, situated inland, sought to assert control over trade routes, leading to centuries of both diplomacy and warfare. But throughout all these shifts, the central role of gold never changed. It remained the unshakable foundation of their society. In every marketplace transaction, gold weights ensured not only fair exchange but moral reflection. Chiefs were buried with it not for wealth in the afterlife, but to signify their eternal identity as guardians of their people. Gold from these forests found its way into the great cities of North Africa. The Golden Stool, for instance, wasn't just a throne, it was the soul of the nation. It became part of diplomatic rituals, gifted between chiefs and kings as tokens of loyalty and goodwill. Even in warfare, gold had a role, not only funding armies but serving as a reminder of what was being defended: identity, legacy, and sovereignty. And unlike many cultures that hoarded gold in vaults, the Ashanti wore theirs proudly, on their bodies, in their hair, across their homes, as living testaments to their civilization's depth and dignity. Crafted entirely from gold and never meant to touch the ground, it was said to have descended from the sky through the invocation of Komfo Anokye, the legendary priest who helped found the Ashanti Empire. The stool didn't merely represent authority, it was authority. Whoever held the Golden Stool didn't just rule the Ashanti, they were the Ashanti. And across the Mediterranean, eventually fueling parts of the Islamic world and even reaching the markets of Venice and beyond. Yet, long before outsiders arrived, local communities had already mastered the art of mining and refining this treasure. Far from being simple measuring tools, these weights were miniature masterpieces of art, mathematics, and morality. Crafted in shapes of animals, tools, geometric patterns, and human figures, each gold weight told a story, often tied to an Akan proverb. A weight shaped like a crocodile with two heads but one stomach reminded merchants, two leaders with different agendas destroy the nation. Another, carved like a tortoise, whispered, "Wisdom is not speed." To the people who lived there, the land was alive, sacred, and generous. Using simple yet effective tools, wooden pans, sieves, and stone hammers, they extracted alluvial gold from riverbeds and, over time, developed techniques for shallow pit mining. Families and clans often passed down mining territories, guarded with respect and protected by customary law. These were not the chaotic gold rushes of the Western world. They were well-ordered, community-led enterprises. The labor was hard, yes, but it was embedded in social life and tied to ritual and tradition. Before mining began, libations were poured to the spirits of the earth. The land was not just a resource, it was a living partner, and its most prized gift was gold. The land itself played a vital role in shaping the destiny of the Ashanti. Unlike the open savannas to the north or the coastal plains to the south, the Ashanti homeland was carved into the thick forest belt, a terrain both protective and prosperous. These forests concealed more than just villages and footpaths. They held within them some of the richest gold deposits on the continent. For centuries, rivers like the Ofen, Pra, and Ankabra ran thick with gold particles, leading to the region's historical name, the Gold Coast. It wasn't a colonial exaggeration. The earth sparkled with promise, but this natural wealth didn't go unnoticed. The ancestors of the Ashanti had been working the gold fields for generations. What made Ashanti gold unique wasn't just its quantity, but its cultural depth. In Ashanti political culture, gold had its own language, one that spoke through objects, rituals, and regalia. This spiritual weight extended into everyday life. Gold was used in naming ceremonies, marriages, funerals, and festivals. But perhaps the most intellectually fascinating use of gold was found in Ashanti gold weights, tiny, beautifully cast brass or bronze objects used to measure gold dust, which was the primary currency of the region. These gold weights weren't merely decorative, they were educational. They taught values, upheld social codes, and preserved collective memory. As trade intensified, especially with the arrival of the Kinze, Portuguese in the 15th century and the Dutch and British, thereafter, Ashanti gold became increasingly tied to global markets. The Ashanti were not naive to the value of what they possessed. Even today, remnants of this golden legacy shine brightly. Gold is often described as timeless. But in Ashantiland, it is also timely. In this land of gold, the Ashanti didn't just survive. In the heart of West Africa's forest belt, amid golden rivers and sacred groves, a kingdom was born, not by accident, but by vision. That vision belonged to Osei Tutu, a warrior prince, and Komfo Anokye, a mystical priest of legendary power. Together, they forged more than just a state. They forged an empire, one whose heartbeat was gold and whose soul descended from the heavens. These were independent chiefdoms, Denkira, Akwamu, Akiem, Bono, and many others, each rich in tradition, gold, and pride. Among them was a relatively small but ambitious clan known as the Kwaman, later to be known as Kumasi. He was a man shaped by experience, patient, intelligent, and charismatic. But his greatest asset was his partnership with Komfo Anokye, a priest and spiritual leader whose presence in Ashanti history feels almost mythic. Anokye was believed to command the forces of nature, speak with the gods, and even summon objects from the heavens. Whether miracle worker, mystic, or master of performance, his role was crucial. He gave divine legitimacy to Osei Tutu's ambition. Komfo Anokye declared that the Golden Stool housed the sumsum, the soul, of the Ashanti nation. Crafted entirely of gold and floated mystically from the heavens to rest on Osei Tutu's lap, it instantly became the supreme spiritual emblem of unity. One by one, neighboring states were brought into a growing confederacy. Some joined through diplomacy and persuasion, others through military strength. But unlike mere conquest, the Ashanti model of unification offered a compelling blend of autonomy and allegiance. Each state retained its own chief and internal governance but pledged loyalty to the central authority, the Asantewaa, or king, seated in Kumasi, the newly established capital. No ruler could be legitimate without its blessing. No outsider could touch it without invoking war. The stool was not a symbol of authority. It was the authority. Laws were standardized, roads were constructed, and military alliances were formalized. Tribes once at war now traded, married, and strategized together. It was more than an empire. It was a federation of belief. Located at the crossroads of major trade routes, it became a thriving metropolis where gold, coconut, slaves, textiles, and ideas flowed freely. The city was meticulously organized, with wide avenues, administrative quarters, and a central palace that dazzled European visitors. Foreigners who visited Kumasi described it as sophisticated, orderly, and powerful, a far cry from the stereotypes of African societies that would later be weaponized during colonialism. Though not the strongest at the time, Kwaman held a strategic position inland and was increasingly frustrated by Denkira's dominance over the gold trade and regional politics. It was in this cauldron of tension that Osei Tutu emerged. The birth of the Ashanti Empire was not simply a tale of conquest, but of divine orchestration, political brilliance, and cultural cohesion. By the late 17th century, the region now known as Ghana was a patchwork of small, competing Akan-speaking states. Born into royalty but exiled during his youth, Osei Tutu spent his early years learning the art of diplomacy and warfare in foreign courts. The alliance between these two men, one political, one spiritual, became the cornerstone of what would soon be the Ashanti Empire. Komfo Anokye, understanding the fragmented loyalties of the Akan peoples, knew that political treaties alone would not unite them. What was needed was a spiritual symbol so profound, so sacred, that no clan could claim it as their own, and yet all would revere it. And so, in a dramatic moment now etched into legend, he called down from the sky the Golden Stool. This stool was not meant to be sat upon. Unlike European thrones, it represented not the ruler's power, but the people's essence. With this divine foundation laid, Osei Tutu began the work of building an empire. The genius of this arrangement was its balance. Local traditions were respected, yet a shared identity, anchored in the Golden Stool, began to emerge. Kumasi, under Osei Tutu's rule, rapidly transformed into a political, economic, and spiritual nerve center. But the Ashanti Empire's true strength lay in its government and military structure, both of which were far ahead of their time. The Ashanti operated under a centralized monarchy with the Asantewaa at the top. But beneath him was a complex system of councils and regional chiefs who governed local affairs. He was advised by a council of elders, the Queen Mother, and military commanders. The Queen Mother was not a ceremonial role. She had the authority to nominate heirs, counsel the king, and even veto decisions in matters of tradition and justice. Decisions of national importance were made by the Asantewaa Council, a deliberative body that included representatives from all member states. His death was mourned across the land, and his body was never recovered, a mystery that only deepened his mythic status. Their confederacy would not only repel external threats and expand its territory, but also evolve a unique governance model that stood apart from European feudalism or Islamic caliphates. It was an African system rooted in consultation, tradition, spirituality, and strength. But he had done what few could. He had taken a fragmented landscape and forged it into one of the most formidable empires in Africa. This was not a kingdom born of accident or foreign design. It was intentional, visionary, and deeply African. The golden rivers gave it wealth, but its leaders gave it shape. And at the center of it all, more sacred than the palace, more powerful than the sword, was a stool. Not just any stool, but the Golden Stool, shining not only with gold, but with the collective spirit of a people determined to define their own destiny. Komfo Anokye continued to serve under Tutu's successor and is said to have vanished mysteriously, leaving behind miracles, legends, and sacred trees that still stand in Ghana today. Structured, hierarchical, and disciplined, it was organized into wings, front, rear, center, and flanks, with commanders known as Krontahine, Nifahine, and Benkamhine leading various divisions. Communication on the battlefield was handled through drums, horns, and coded signals, while morale was maintained through songs, symbols, and ceremonial oaths. Warriors fought not just for territory, but to defend the soul of the nation, the Golden Stool, and the honor of their lineage. This ensured that power was not absolute but collaborative, woven into a system of checks, balances, and communal input. The king was seen not just as a political ruler, but as the embodiment of the people, Swill and the guardian of the land as spirit. Equally impressive was the Ashanti military. Weapons were locally forged iron swords, spears, and shields, later enhanced with imported firearms through trade. But perhaps the most powerful weapon was the belief that the ancestors fought alongside the living. That battle was not just a contest of strength, but a spiritual trial. Rituals were held before and after war, and the fallen were remembered as heroes whose spirits would continue to protect the realm. Osei Tutu's legacy as a builder of nations was tragically cut short when he was killed in battle around 1717, reportedly by a sniper from the rival Akiem state. The foundation laid by these two men would carry the Ashanti through centuries of triumph and trial. To speak of the birth of the Ashanti Empire is to speak of purpose. With the Ashanti Empire firmly established under visionary leadership and bound together by the sacred Golden Stool, the next phase of its rise was marked by a dazzling surge in wealth and international entanglements. Situated in one of the richest gold-producing regions in the world, the Ashanti didn't merely benefit from their geography, they mastered it. They became the beating economic heart of West Africa, a hub where local ambition met global desire. They integrated themselves into this ancient economy, becoming powerful intermediaries. They were followed in the centuries that followed by the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, and eventually the British. These coastal groups acted as middlemen, controlling the flow of inland gold to the European ships waiting in their ports. To the Ashanti, this arrangement was deeply frustrating. Though the gold originated in Ashanti lands, it was being taxed and traded by intermediaries who grew rich off Ashanti labor. This economic tension quickly turned into political rivalry. These powers established fortified trading posts along the Gulf of Guinea, castles and forts that would become infamous in later centuries for their role in the transatlantic slave trade. The arts flourished here: goldsmithing, carving, cloth weaving, and music. Royal courts sponsored artisans who created magnificent regalia, not merely for beauty, but as symbols of political hierarchy and cultural identity. The kente cloth, woven with dazzling patterns and rich meaning, became both fashion and statement. Festivals like Akwazede turned the city into a living museum, where music, drumming, and pageantry connected the present with the ancestral past. The Fant had embraced European alliances, benefiting from European weapons and goods in exchange for their loyalty. They also had the advantage of geography. Nestled along the coast, they controlled access to the key ports and fortresses. But the Ashanti were not content with remaining inland suppliers. They saw control of the coastal trade routes as essential to their sovereignty and economic independence. But initially, it was gold they craved, and nowhere on the coast was the metal more abundant than the regions bordering the Ashanti domain. These were not simply wars of territory, they were wars of access, of influence, and of control over the region's most valuable asset, gold. In several instances, the Ashanti pushed their armies southward, defeating Fant coalitions and temporarily securing direct trade routes to the coast. But their gains were often short-lived. Coastal resistance, backed by European arms, remained formidable. Their location, tucked in the forest belt and straddling key north-south trade routes, allowed them to control and tax the movement of goods with efficiency and authority. Built with elegance and defended with pride, Kumasi became a bustling hub of commerce, culture, and craftsmanship. Merchants from across the region brought ivory, salt, kola nuts, slaves, and livestock to its markets. In return, they received gold, fine textiles, and Ashanti ironwork. The city's markets bustled with activity. Gold dust served as currency, measured meticulously with ornate brass weights and stored in leather pouches. To walk through the streets of Kumasi was to witness an empire alive with wealth and purpose. But it was the arrival of European powers on the coast that would truly change the scale and tempo of Ashanti trade. Yet alongside the riches came rivalries, tensions, and growing pressure from foreign powers whose eyes were fixed not just on Ashanti gold, but on the empire itself. For centuries, the lands of West Africa had been part of a sophisticated trade ecosystem that spanned the continent and beyond. Before the rise of the Atlantic world, trans-Saharan trade routes had already carved deep arteries across Africa's body. Camel caravans journeyed across the Sahara, connecting the gold fields of the south to the bustling merchant cities of the north like Timbuktu, Jen, and Gao. From there, goods made their way into North Africa and Europe. In exchange for their gold, the peoples of the south received salt, textiles, horses, and later, firearms. The Ashanti, although emerging centuries after these networks first flourished, inherited the knowledge and infrastructure that enabled them to thrive. By the 15th century, the Portuguese had arrived on the West African coast, drawn by rumors of gold-laden kingdoms. Here, the Ashanti found both opportunity and threat. The coastal tribes, particularly the Fant, Ga, and Akwamu, had already established relationships with the Europeans. The Fant Confederacy in particular became a constant obstacle to Ashanti trade ambitions. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, a series of conflicts erupted between the Ashanti and the coastal tribes, with each skirmish carrying both political and economic weight. Amid this struggle, the city of Kumasi grew in stature and symbolism. It was more than a political capital, it was the golden capital. But Kumasi was not just an economic powerhouse. It was also a cultural beacon. Yet while Kumasi gleamed with confidence, the presence of European powers on the coast grew darker and more complex. The Portuguese had been the first to arrive, but their influence waned in the 17th century as the Dutch and British increased their presence. They signed treaties with coastal chiefs, provided firearms to preferred allies, and slowly embedded themselves into the political landscape. While the Ashanti sought to negotiate with these foreign powers on equal terms, the Europeans increasingly viewed the empire as both a threat and a target. The Dutch West India Company established control over Elmina Castle, a fortress originally built by the Portuguese, while the British expanded their influence from Cape Coast Castle, their main base of operations in the region. European powers were desperate to access the wealth of the interior without paying the price demanded by the Ashanti. Mining intensified, labor demands increased. Some rival states resented Kumasi's dominance. The Ashanti Empire stood as the last major obstacle to total British dominance in the region. Trade was no longer merely about profit. It had become political, and political conflict inevitably turned to war. The use of enslaved labor within the empire itself became more widespread as gold production required ever more manpower. Though the Ashanti often resisted the Atlantic slave trade, preferring to use captives for domestic purposes or ransom, they were nonetheless drawn into its orbit. The complex relationship between gold, trade, and slavery became an inescapable part of the empire's economy, a moral dilemma that echoed across the continent. And the Ashanti, protective of their sovereignty, refused to allow foreign powers to bypass their authority. Every ounce of gold that left the empire was not just a unit of wealth. It was a symbol of power, legitimacy, and autonomy. Gold was still central to their aims, but the British were also now heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade and later colonial expansion. But even before full-scale conflict, the seeds of hostility had been planted during trade negotiations. Ashanti envoys demanded fair treatment, direct trade access to British forts, and respect for their sovereignty. Their embassies continued to negotiate, their kings continued to demand recognition, and their merchants continued to trade. They sought partnership, not plunder. Respect, not subjugation. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for one of the most defiant stands against colonialism in African history, a stand built, quite literally, on gold. In a world shifting rapidly under the weight of imperial ambition, the Ashanti held their ground with stubborn dignity. But the British, emboldened by their coastal allies and ambitions, often disregarded these requests. Misunderstandings turned into provocations. The death of emissaries, the blocking of trade caravans, and the disrespect of Ashanti customs all contributed to a growing climate of mistrust. They feared the rise of a powerful inland empire that could challenge their dominance on the coast. Meanwhile, the Ashanti feared British interference in their internal affairs and trade networks. Tensions escalated quickly. These Europeans were not merely passive traders. They were shrewd strategists, skilled in exploiting local rivalries and gradually increasing their influence through diplomacy, manipulation, and force. By the early 19th century, British interest in Ashanti lands intensified. A series of confrontations, later known as the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, would dominate the century. At the heart of this geopolitical tension remained the core issue: gold. But gold also came at a cost. As demand for it grew, so too did the internal pressure on Ashanti society. By the mid-19th century, the British had declared the Gold Coast a formal colony, though large portions remained outside their control. But even as war loomed, the Ashanti refused to yield. Theirs was not just a story of trade, but of economic resistance, a refusal to be reduced to mere suppliers in someone else's empire. To enter the court of the Ashanti kings was to step into a living tapestry of power and symbolism, where every shimmer of gold, every beat of the drum, and every line of cloth spoke volumes. Gold was everywhere, in crowns shaped like suns, in heavy necklaces that draped down to the chest, in armlets, rings, and sandals. Each piece had a story. Some represented historical events, others captured proverbs, and still others bore the faces of ancestors or deities. The golden sword of state, the Mpampanzu, was not just a weapon but a symbol of the king's oath to protect and uphold justice. Nowhere was this balance more evident than in the role of women, and especially in the revered position of the Queen Mother. She was the mother of the royal lineage, not always the biological mother of the king, but the woman through whom royal blood was traced. The Ashanti, like many Akan societies, followed matrilineal inheritance, meaning lineage, property, and kingship passed through the mother's line. The Queen Mother selected and could even depose a king. She presided over courts, owned land, and was seen as a custodian of wisdom and tradition. In a world where colonial narratives often erased or minimized female power, the Ashanti offer a compelling counterstory, one where women not only advised kings but made kings. Adornments, such as the Duenemin pendant, shaped like ram's horns, reminded rulers to be both strong and humble. Royal umbrellas, fans, and palanquins bore golden finials and emblems, each speaking of lineage, conquest, or divine favor. Markets were dominated by women traders, many of whom managed vast networks of trade in gold dust, textiles, and foodstuffs. Some women controlled so much wealth that they rivaled lesser chiefs in influence. Others were priestesses, custodians of shrines, and keepers of oral traditions. Far from being sidelined, women were central actors in the cultural, economic, and spiritual life of the empire. The Asanahin, the king of the Ashanti, would appear not just as a political leader, but as the embodiment of the people's ancestral spirit. Held every 6 weeks in the Ashanti calendar, Akweside was more than celebration. It was spiritual alignment. On this sacred day, the king would emerge in full regalia to honor the ancestors, commune with the people, and reaffirm the unity of the state. Drums thundered. Dancers swirled in cloths of red, gold, and green. Praise singers chanted royal epics while courtiers processed with swords and umbrellas glinting in the sun, covered in intricate layers of shimmering gold that weighed as heavily with history as with value. This was a society not just adorned in gold but defined by it, a civilization that transformed wealth into meaning and beauty into memory. While many empires have flaunted their riches, the Ashanti used theirs to express identity, hierarchy, spirituality, and eternal continuity. It was not materialism. It was metaphysical expression. At the apex of this visual culture stood the Ashanti royal regalia, a breathtaking display of craftsmanship, pageantry, and sacred symbolism. But this gold was not merely decoration. Beyond royalty, gold signaled status in the broader Ashanti society. Wealthy merchants, chiefs, warriors, and even musicians were entitled to wear gold, but always within the limits prescribed by custom and rank. To wear what one had not earned or what was reserved for another's status was a serious offense. In this way, gold regulated society not through force, but through visibility. It told everyone who you were, what you had achieved, and what expectations rested on your shoulders. Yet Ashanti society was never simply hierarchical. It was deeply structured, yes, but also deeply balanced. The Ohema, or Queen Mother, held enormous political and spiritual authority. Beyond the palace, Ashanti women were also formidable in commerce and craft. This intricate social fabric came alive during the festivals, especially the renowned Akwazede festival. At the center of it all stood the Golden Stool, never touched by human feet, never placed on the ground. It was brought out and displayed during major Akwazede celebrations, surrounded by rituals and libations. Commoners, traders, farmers, warriors, all came to the palace courtyard to witness, to celebrate, to speak. The king listened, elders advised. Visitors brought grievances, and judgments were rendered. It was pageantry with purpose, a moment when power dressed itself in humility and tradition stood taller than even the crown. The stool connected past, present, and future, a reminder that the Ashanti were not merely a people, but a chain of generations bound together by gold and memory. Each beat carried not just rhythm, but meaning. The Ashanti understood that sound was a language, and in the drum, they found a voice that echoed across valleys and generations. In a world that often equates gold with greed, the Ashanti show us another way: gold as remembrance, gold as responsibility, gold as connection to the divine. But Akwazede was also democratic in its own way. While the rituals were royal, the participation was communal. The Asanahin remains a figure of immense respect, and festivals like Akwazede draw visitors from around the world. They imbued it with spirit, structured their society around it, and used it to express both the divine and the daily. In their hands, gold ceased to be metal. It became memory, message, and meaning. Kente cloth now appears on global stages, from presidential inaugurations to fashion runways, still carrying its ancestral meanings. Gold jewelry crafted in Kumasi is sold across Africa and in the diaspora, continuing a legacy that is as much about identity as it is about elegance. They saturated the everyday, from the way homes were decorated to the songs sung while pounding fufu or weaving cloth. Art was not a luxury. It was a necessity, a vessel for memory, a guardian of identity, and a mirror for the soul. This fusion of art, ritual, and meaning extended far beyond the festival grounds. The art and oral traditions of the Ashanti were legendary. Stories were not simply told, they were performed. Elders recounted histories and fables around fires, using parables and proverbs that condensed centuries of wisdom into a few poetic lines. A simple tale about a spider or tortoise might carry lessons on leadership, diplomacy, or loyalty. Visual art was equally profound. Goldsmiths, carvers, and weavers created masterpieces with spiritual depth. The kente cloth, perhaps the most iconic of Ashanti arts, was more than a garment, it was a message. Every man and woman had their own stool, which was considered the seat of their soul. When a person died, their stool was blackened and preserved in a shrine, a way of honoring their spirit and keeping their presence in the family. Linguist staffs, with their carved finials, depicted popular proverbs and were carried by court spokesmen. They were not just artistic flourishes, they were tools of governance. Each pattern, each color combination carried meaning. Some spoke of wealth and bravery, others of mourning or transformation. Wearing kente was like wearing a poem, a coded language wrapped around the body. Certain patterns were reserved for royalty. Others were worn during specific life events or rites of passage. Wood carving was another celebrated form. Stools, in particular, held enormous symbolic weight. Music and dance were ever present. The talking drum, with its ability to mimic human speech, was used to announce royal decrees, summon warriors, or recite praise names. These artistic expressions were not confined to rituals or court life. It is this depth, this insistence that every object, every act, and every adornment must carry meaning that sets Ashanti society apart. Even today, these traditions endure. The Ashanti monarchy still thrives in modern Ghana, not as a political power, but as a cultural beacon. The Ashanti did not simply possess gold. They understood it. In the age of empire, many nations fell quickly under the weight of European ambition, colonized with shocking speed and brutal efficiency. But the Ashanti were not among them. For nearly a century, from 1823 to 1901, they resisted the most powerful imperial force of the time, the British Empire, with a boldness rooted not only in strategy but in spirit. Their resistance was relentless, courageous, and defiant, a war not just of bullets and blades, but of values, of worldviews. It was a battle between one empire that ruled with treaties and gunboats, and another that ruled through ancestral memory, sacred gold, and the beating soul of a people. In 1863, another brief conflict flared up, but heavy rains, disease, and disorganization brought it to a quick and inconclusive end. They fielded a modern army equipped with advanced firearms, artillery, and logistical support, bolstered by African allies, including long-standing Ashanti rivals like the Fant. The British force cut through Ashanti territory and eventually reached the capital, Kumasi. However, it was the Third Anglo-Ashanti War, from 1873 to 1874, that marked a turning point. This time, the British were determined to break the Ashanti stronghold and secure unchallenged control of the Gold Coast. The Ashanti-British Wars were not a single campaign, but a long and bitter series of confrontations, 5 wars in total, each one steeped in misunderstanding, miscalculation, and the British failure to grasp the true nature of Ashanti civilization. Unlike the brutal campaign of 1874, this one was swift and bloodless. A farmer, a mother, and a matriarch, Yaa Asantewaa, rose at a time when others hesitated. To the Ashanti, this was not just an insult, it was blasphemy. The stool was never to be sat on by anyone, not even the king. It was holy, it was inviolable. The British demand revealed, more than anything, how little they understood the people they sought to rule. The British, arrogant and unaware of Ashanti spirituality, had made a grave mistake. They demanded the Golden Stool. The Ashanti, hoping to avoid further devastation, chose not to resist militarily. The Asanahin, Prempe I, was captured along with his court and exiled to the Seychelles. British officials declared the Ashanti Kingdom formally annexed, and Kumasi was made the seat of colonial administration. The British believed they had finally won. The timeline of these wars forms a powerful arc, tracing the evolution of conflict from skirmish to siege and finally to revolution. A humiliating treaty was imposed in 1874, forcing the Ashanti to cede territory and pay reparations. But even in defeat, the Ashanti refused to vanish. They retreated into the forest, reorganized, and prepared to resist again. The Golden Stool remained untouched, hidden and protected, a silent declaration that while cities might fall, the soul of the Ashanti could not be conquered. The first major clash came in 1823, sparked by trade disputes, territorial ambition, and an underlying contest for dominance in the region. By now, the scramble for Africa was in full force, with European powers racing to claim lands across the continent. The Ashanti Empire, though weakened, remained a rare African power that had not been colonized. That status made it a target. The British, who had established themselves along the coast in places like Cape Coast Castle, began expanding their influence inland. They viewed the Ashanti as obstacles to their growing interests. When a British colonial governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, led a force to confront Ashanti expansion near the Pra River, he grossly underestimated Ashanti's strength. In a swift and devastating ambush, Ashanti forces annihilated the British column. McCarthy was killed, his skull taken as a war trophy, a chilling reminder that the Ashanti would not be easily subdued. The war ended with an uneasy peace in 1831, drawing a boundary between Ashanti lands and British coastal territories, but the tension simmered just beneath the surface. The Ashanti had defended their sovereignty, and the British had learned a costly lesson. But neither side believed the conflict was truly over. Decades later, as British colonial ambitions intensified, hostilities resumed. Under the leadership of Sir Garnet Wolseley, the British launched a full-scale campaign. The city fell, Kumasi was sacked, the royal palace looted, and sacred artifacts, including golden regalia and ceremonial treasures, were seized. In the final years of the 19th century, the British returned once more, emboldened by their imperial momentum. In 1895, British forces launched another expedition to Kumasi. But they were wrong. Because what they failed to understand, what they always failed to understand, was that the true heart of the Ashanti Empire was not its king, nor its palace, but the Golden Stool. In 1900, the final and most symbolic conflict erupted, the War of the Golden Stool, led not by a general or a king, but by a woman, Yaa Asantewaa, the Queen Mother of Ejisu. Governor Frederick Hodgson, seated in the heart of Kumasi, summoned Ashanti leaders and brazenly declared that the Golden Stool, the sacred soul of the Ashanti people, be brought to him to sit upon. As the male chiefs deliberated in stunned silence, Yaa Asantewaa stood up. Her words were fire. "If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight." She rallied warriors, fortified strongholds, and led an uprising that stunned the British administration. Her army laid siege to the Kumasi fort, cutting off supplies and communication. For months, the British garrison was trapped, under siege by fighters armed with muskets, spears, and ancestral fury. "We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefield." Her defiance sparked a revolution. With the Asanahin in exile and morale low, it was Yaa Asantewaa who organized the resistance. The stool was returned to the Ashanti, its sacredness acknowledged, at least formally, by the colonial administration. Kumasi was transformed, its palaces reduced, and its people monitored. The British declared the territory a protectorate, folded into the colony of the Gold Coast. The royal family remained in exile. Though the empire had been dismantled, its spiritual core endured. Far from it. Though eventually reinforced and able to break the siege, the British were shaken. The symbols of the Ashanti Empire, the stool, the kente, the drums, became national symbols of strength and dignity. Yaa Asantewaa's legacy was resurrected in poetry, theater, and education. The British had occupied the land, but they had never occupied the soul. They maintained their chieftaincy system. They continued to honor their customs, tell their stories, and celebrate their festivals, refusing to let your story be written by someone else. The Asanahin was eventually restored, though now as a cultural monarch, rather than a sovereign one, and the Golden Stool remained central to the people as identity. They remind the world that resistance is not always about winning battles. Sometimes it's about refusing to be forgotten. The British brought modern warfare. The Ashanti brought ancient purpose. And though the British ultimately claimed political victory, it was the Ashanti who claimed the deeper triumph, the survival of their identity, their sacred symbols, and their unbreakable will. The fact that a woman had led a rebellion of such magnitude shattered colonial assumptions and inspired future generations across Africa and the diaspora. When news of this desecration spread, the Ashanti were outraged. The culprits were arrested, not by the British, but by their own people, and executed according to traditional law. It was a defining moment. Even without a king, even after decades of occupation, the Ashanti still held their sacred code. The British realized they could rule the land, but they would never rule the soul. Yaa Asantewaa was eventually captured and exiled, also to the Seychelles, but her legacy lived on. She became a symbol of resistance, of courage, of a spirit that bows to no empire. The Golden Stool, despite all British efforts, was never surrendered. During the siege, Ashanti loyalists hid the stool deep in the forest, protected by secret keepers sworn to protect it with their lives. For years, its whereabouts were unknown, and the British, embarrassed by their cultural blunder, attempted to downplay the incident. It wasn't until 1921 that the stool was accidentally discovered, but not by colonial authorities. 3 local men found the stool and attempted to strip it of its gold. Eventually, a compromise was reached. By 1901, the Ashanti Empire, as a political entity, was officially over. They were clashes of civilization where bullets met beliefs and empires collided with ancestral memory. But this was not the end of Ashanti identity. Throughout the colonial period, the Ashanti retained a strong sense of self. When Ghana gained independence in 1957, it did so with the Ashanti as a proud part of its heritage. The Ashanti-British wars were more than military engagements. From the golden courts of Kumasi to the prisons of Seychelles, the Ashanti carried their soul in a stool, their wisdom in proverbs, and their courage in women like Yaa Asantewaa. In the age of empire, many nations fell quickly under the weight of European ambition, colonized with shocking speed and brutal efficiency. But the Ashanti were not among them. For nearly a century, from 1823 to 1901, they resisted the most powerful imperial force of the time, the British Empire, with a boldness rooted not only in strategy but in spirit. The timeline of these wars forms a powerful arc, tracing the evolution of conflict from skirmish to siege and finally to revolution. Their resistance was relentless, courageous, and defiant, a war not just of bullets and blades, but of values, of worldviews. It was a battle between one empire that ruled with treaties and gunboats, and another that ruled through ancestral memory, sacred gold, and the beating soul of a people. In 1863, another brief conflict flared up, but heavy rains, disease, and disorganization brought it to a quick and inconclusive end. However, it was the Third Anglo-Ashanti War, from 1873 to 1874, that marked a turning point. A humiliating treaty was imposed in 1874, forcing the Ashanti to cede territory and pay reparations. But even in defeat, the Ashanti refused to vanish. They retreated into the forest, reorganized, and prepared to resist again. Unlike the brutal campaign of 1874, this one was swift and bloodless. The Ashanti, hoping to avoid further devastation, chose not to resist militarily. The Asanahin, Prempe I, was captured along with his court and exiled to the Seychelles. A farmer, a mother, and a matriarch, Yaa Asantewaa rose at a time when others hesitated. The British, arrogant and unaware of Ashanti spirituality, had made a grave mistake. They demanded the Golden Stool. British officials declared the Ashanti Kingdom formally annexed, and Kumasi was made the seat of colonial administration. The British believed they had finally won. To the Ashanti, this was not just an insult, it was blasphemy. The stool was never to be sat on by anyone, not even the king. It was holy. It was inviolable. The British demand revealed, more than anything, how little they understood the people they sought to rule. The Golden Stool remained untouched, hidden and protected, a silent declaration that while cities might fall, the soul of the Ashanti could not be conquered. This time, the British were determined to break the Ashanti stronghold and secure unchallenged control of the Gold Coast. The Ashanti-British wars were not a single campaign, but a long and bitter series of confrontations, 5 wars in total, each one steeped in misunderstanding, miscalculation, and the British failure to grasp the true nature of Ashanti civilization. They fielded a modern army equipped with advanced firearms, artillery, and logistical support, bolstered by African allies, including long-standing Ashanti rivals like the Fanta. The British force cut through Ashanti territory and eventually reached the capital, Kumasi. The first major clash came in 1823, sparked by trade disputes, territorial ambition, and an underlying contest for dominance in the region. The British, who had established themselves along the coast in places like Cape Coast Castle, began expanding their influence inland. By now, the scramble for Africa was in full force, with European powers racing to claim lands across the continent. The Ashanti Empire, though weakened, remained a rare African power that had not been colonized. That status made it a target. The Ashanti had defended their sovereignty, and the British had learned a costly lesson. But neither side believed the conflict was truly over. They viewed the Ashanti as obstacles to their growing interests. When a British colonial governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, led a force to confront Ashanti expansion near the Pra River, he grossly underestimated Ashanti strength. In a swift and devastating ambush, Ashanti forces annihilated the British column. McCarthy was killed, his skull taken as a war trophy, a chilling reminder that the Ashanti would not be easily subdued. The war ended with an uneasy peace in 1831, drawing a boundary between Ashanti lands and British coastal territories, but the tension simmered just beneath the surface. Decades later, as British colonial ambitions intensified, hostilities resumed. Under the leadership of Sir Garnet Wolseley, the British launched a full-scale campaign. The city fell, Kumasi was sacked, the royal palace looted, and sacred artifacts, including golden regalia and ceremonial treasures, were seized. In the final years of the 19th century, the British returned once more, emboldened by their imperial momentum. In 1895, British forces launched another expedition to Kumasi. But they were wrong. Because what they failed to understand, what they always failed to understand, was that the true heart of the Ashanti Empire was not its king, nor its palace, but the Golden Stool. In 1900, the final and most symbolic conflict erupted, the War of the Golden Stool, led not by a general or a king, but by a woman, Yaa Asantewaa, the Queen Mother of Ejisu. Governor Frederick Hodgson, seated in the heart of Kumasi, summoned Ashanti leaders and brazenly declared that the Golden Stool, the sacred soul of the Ashanti people, be brought to him to sit upon. The guns had fallen silent. The palaces of Kumasi stood scarred and looted. The Asanahin was in exile, and the British flag fluttered over the Gold Coast. By 1901, the Ashanti Empire, once a proud, independent African kingdom, had been absorbed into the British colonial machine. For the British, the Ashanti Kingdom was not merely a rebellious frontier, it was a gold mine, quite literally. As industrialization surged in Europe, the appetite for raw materials intensified. Gold, which had given Ashanti its glory, now became the very instrument of its exploitation. In pre-colonial Ashanti society, gold had been sacred, used in royal passed down through generations, forged into art and identity. Colonial administrators understood that as long as the Ashanti monarchy, customs, and symbols retained influence, true subjugation would remain incomplete. Traditional festivals were restricted, court gatherings discouraged, and customary laws subordinated to colonial rule. Chiefs, once autonomous leaders backed by ancestral authority, were forced to swear allegiance to the British crown. Those who cooperated were often manipulated into becoming colonial intermediaries, representatives not of their people, but of the empire. Those who resisted were deposed or exiled. It is carried in names, spoken in proverbs, sung in dirges, woven into cloth, and drummed into the soil. And so, even as British laws replaced customary ones and colonial courts rose in Kumasi, the spirit of Ashanti society lived on, underground, unbroken, unbowed. And so, the British embarked on a campaign of cultural suppression and reprogramming, seeking to dismantle the very foundations of Ashanti power. With every drumbeat, every hidden libation poured to the ancestors, every whispered proverb passed from elder to child, the people remembered who they were. Generations of young Ashanti were raised to view their own culture as inferior. The Asanahin remained in exile, and the stool sat empty. The British hoped that, over time, the memory of kingship would fade, that the people would grow used to their new governors, new flags, new maps. Christianity, while embraced by many in sincerity, was also used as a tool of control. Traditional religious practices were condemned as pagan, and shrines were destroyed or abandoned. Now, it was reduced to a commodity, faceless, formless, and foreign-owned. The mines dug more than tunnels. They carved wounds into the cultural landscape. But while the British claimed political control, what they did not realize was that true conquest would require more than soldiers and treaties. It would demand the erasure of a civilization's soul, and that they could never accomplish. What followed the final Anglo-Ashanti War was not peace, but occupation, economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and calculated efforts to erase the Ashanti's political power and spiritual identity. And yet, even in this darkness, the Ashanti people did what they had always done in times of crisis. They adapted, resisted, and remembered. Gold, once the sacred symbol of unity and authority in Ashanti culture, became a target for colonial extraction. The British quickly moved to control mining operations, establishing companies and licenses that sidelined indigenous miners. Foreign companies like Ashanti Goldfields Corporation emerged as dominant players, extracting vast amounts of gold from the region. While some joined voluntarily, lured by wages, many others were subjected to forced labor practices disguised under taxation laws and village quotas. Men toiled deep underground, breathing toxic air and risking collapse, while colonial officers oversaw operations and profits flowed outward to London, to shareholders, to the empire. These companies operated with full support from the colonial government, which built railways, roads, and infrastructure, not for the benefit of the Ashanti, but to ensure smoother extraction and export of resources. Local populations were conscripted into working in these mines, often under harsh, dangerous, and inhumane conditions. These gold operations stripped the land not only of its mineral wealth, but of its meaning. But the assault on Ashanti society went far beyond economics. The Golden Stool, though recovered and respected in form, was sidelined in function. Even education was weaponized. British-run mission schools taught English, European history, and Christian doctrine, while portraying Ashanti customs as primitive or superstitious. The Ashanti monarchy, the heart of the people's identity, was systematically dismantled. But memory in Ashanti culture is not held in books. Where empire sought control, the Ashanti built spaces of quiet rebellion, underground sanctuaries of memory and tradition. Chiefs and elders held secret meetings. Oral historians continued to recite the chronicles of Osei Tutu and Komfo Anokye, keeping alive the story of the Golden Stool. Women preserved sacred rites, birth traditions, funeral customs, often behind closed doors, away from colonial eyes. Young men were still taught the old songs, the warrior chants, the meanings of kente patterns, and the responsibilities of stool lineage. Even in colonial courts, many Ashanti refused to settle disputes through British law, instead relying on traditional arbitration led by clan elders. In marketplaces, traders measured gold dust using ancient gold weights, tiny brass figurines shaped like animals, objects, and symbols of wisdom. These weights, dismissed by the British as quaint relics, were in fact mathematical tools and memory aids, encoding centuries of philosophy and values. Thousands lined the roads in silence and awe. Though he was forbidden to use the title Asantewaa, the people greeted him with reverence. Their resilience wasn't loud. It was steady, quiet, and generational. The return of self-rule was not a rebirth for them. It was a restoration. The Golden Stool remained. The kingship was revived. Festivals were reinstated, and the Ashanti identity was no longer whispered. It was sung aloud once more. He did not need a crown or a palace. The Asantewaa remains a cultural monarch in modern Ghana, presiding over ceremonies, settling disputes, and serving as a guardian of tradition. Against the machinery of empire, they chose memory over forgetting, meaning over profit, and culture over collapse. The Golden Stool still rests in its sacred chamber, unseen but deeply felt. He was the king because the people remembered him as such. The British came for gold, but they left confronted by something far more valuable, a people who could not be erased. Resistance also took more visible forms. Tax revolts erupted across the Gold Coast, with Ashanti farmers and merchants refusing colonial levies. The Ashanti had always been a spiritual nation, not in the sense of religion alone, but in their understanding that power comes from a sacred covenant with the past. Their resistance was not merely political, it was existential. And in doing so, they ensured that the Ashanti, golden, fierce, and enduring, would never be forgotten. The exiled royals in Seychelles continued to write letters petitioning for their return and documenting injustices. In time, the exiled King Prempeh I would return home, not to rule politically, but to reign spiritually as a symbol that Ashanti kingship could not be erased. In 1924, after 28 years in exile, Prempeh I was allowed to return to Kumasi. Colonial powers understood how to defeat armies, but they were less prepared for a people whose strength came not from guns, but from cultural memory. They survived not by open rebellion, though they had done that fiercely, but by preserving the inner world the British could never fully see. The stools hidden in back rooms, the elders who spoke softly at night, the children named for ancestors, the songs that said what mouths dared not say aloud. Even in mining towns built for colonial profit, Ashanti workers created their own networks, mutual aid societies, informal courts, church groups that blended Christian and traditional beliefs. By the time Ghana achieved independence in 1957, the Ashanti had not only endured, they had prepared. The story of Ashanti under colonial rule is not one of passive victimhood. It is a tale of cultural genius and tenacious survival. Gold was taken from their lands, but the soul remained anchored in Kumasi. In a stool no invader could touch. In stories no missionary could silence. In a dignity that no empire could diminish. To this day, the Ashanti monarchy exists, not as a relic of the past, but as a living institution. The Ashanti did not win every battle, but they won something greater, the right to define themselves, to remember their story, to pass it on. In the silence beneath empire's noise, they whispered their names. The drums never stopped beating, not in the villages, not in the hearts of the people, and certainly not in Kumasi. Even after colonial chains were fastened and kingdoms reduced to footnotes in foreign records, the Ashanti held on to something deeper than land or title. The people who once defied the most powerful empire in the world did not fade into history. Ghana became a symbol of Pan-African hope, but within this modern republic, the traditional identities had to find their place. The Ashanti, with their proud monarchy and deep cultural institutions, were not eager to dissolve into a generic national narrative. Instead, they have become a pillar of the Ghanaian nation, influencing politics, culture, economy, and diplomacy, while still honoring their unique heritage. They held on to identity. And when Ghana gained independence in 1957, that identity didn't resurface. It had never left. It simply stepped back into the light. Installed in 1999, he represents the continuity of a legacy that spans over 300 years. But he is no ceremonial relic. He is fluent in the language of global development, yet speaks with the authority of ancestral kings. Under his leadership, the Ashanti monarchy has become not just culturally relevant, but diplomatically significant. He is a statesman, a reformer, and a bridge between worlds. The story of the Ashanti in modern Ghana is not one of revival, but of reclamation. While he presides over ancient festivals like Akweside in full regalia, he also uses social media and international partnerships to amplify Ashanti influence. He has become a symbol not just for the Ashanti, but for Africans around the world, proof that tradition can lead, not just follow. The Ashanti monarchy, though stripped of political power, was recognized as a cultural authority. He champions education, healthcare, and peace-building, launching initiatives like the Otumfuo Education Fund, which has supported thousands of Ghanaian students, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds. The Asantewaa became not just a custodian of Ashanti values, but a symbol of Ghana's own deep roots. When Kwame Nkrumah led Ghana into independence, it was the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from colonial rule. Young people speak English at school and Twi at home. Mobile phones buzz during sacred festivals. And yet, when the king speaks, all rise. When the Golden Stool is mentioned, silence still falls. Instead, they offered something powerful, a living tradition that could enrich the new state without contradicting it. In Kumasi, the capital of the Ashanti region, tradition and modernity now walk side by side. Government offices sit near royal courtyards. The Ashanti's role in Ghanaian society today is both ceremonial and practical. Chiefs still mediate community disputes, oversee development projects, and serve as moral compasses. The chieftaincy system, enshrined in Ghana's constitution, remains one of the most respected institutions in the country. And the Ashanti model, with its sophisticated structure of divisional chiefs, queen mothers, and councils, is considered one of the strongest examples of enduring African governance. At the center of this modern Ashanti presence is one man, Otumfuo Nana Osei Tutu, the current Asantewaa. Educated in the United Kingdom, with professional experience in finance and diplomacy, Otumfuo Osei Tutu brings both traditional wisdom and modern vision to his role. He has met with heads of state, represented Ghana on international stages, and advocated for African solutions to African problems. But perhaps most striking is the way he has redefined monarchy for the 21st century. His court welcomes both tradition and technology. Even in modern Ghana, gold continues to flow through Ashanti lands just as it did centuries ago. But the industry today is dominated not by kings or artisans, but by corporations. On the other, it raises questions of environmental degradation, land rights, and community impact. Traditional leaders often find themselves mediating between multinational interests and local concerns, balancing the promise of development with the protection of heritage and land. Ashanti Goldfields Corporation, now part of AngloGold Ashanti, is one of the world's largest gold mining companies. Today, Kumasi is not just a city, it is a living museum where oral tradition, art, and heritage are not frozen in glass cases, but performed daily. Its Obuasi mine, located in the heart of Ashanti territory, has been active for over a century and remains a critical source of Ghana's gold exports. Schools and youth programs emphasize proverbs, traditional etiquette, dance, and drum language. It is more than ceremony, it is living proof that Ashanti culture still commands reverence. On these days, the king appears in gold-laden splendor, the drums roll, and the people dance not in nostalgia but in continuity. They are a living thread woven from the past into the present. Their story, from golden thrones to exiled kings, from resistance wars to global diplomacy, is a testament to Africa's ability to evolve without erasing itself. The Ashanti maintain apprenticeship systems for goldsmiths, weavers, and woodcarvers, ensuring that skills passed down through generations do not die with globalization. In London, New York, Toronto, and Amsterdam, Ashanti communities hold festivals, organize royal visits, and teach Chui to children born thousands of miles from Kumasi. The Golden Stool may sit in Ghana, but its spirit travels wherever Ashanti hearts beat. This industrial mining brings both opportunity and complexity. On one hand, it provides jobs, infrastructure, and foreign investment. Yet even amid corporate expansion, small-scale gold mining, often called galamsey, persists. Some of it is illegal, some of it artisanal, but all of it is tied to a long memory. In villages near Kumasi, old gold weights are still passed down, not for use, but as heirlooms. Through leadership, education, cultural pride, and global engagement, the Ashanti show that identity is not a relic to be displayed. But the truest wealth of the Ashanti has never been their minerals. It is their spirit, undiminished, undefeated, and unforgettable. It is a torch to be carried forward. The cultural significance of gold remains intact, even as its economic landscape has changed. More importantly, Ashanti communities continue to push for local benefit and accountability. Traditional rulers, civil society groups, and youth leaders are increasingly vocal about ensuring that the gold of today benefits the children of tomorrow, a modern echo of the ancient belief that wealth must serve the people. Cultural preservation is not passive, it's intentional, and the Ashanti have become masters of protecting and promoting their legacy. Visitors from Ghana and around the world come to learn the story of the empire, to see royal artifacts, and to hear the tale of resistance, glory, and resilience. The museum preserves golden regalia, war drums, stools, and manuscripts, and stands as a proud counter to colonial narratives that once portrayed African kingdoms as primitive or voiceless. The Manhia Palace Museum, located in the restored palace of Asanahin Prempe I, is a major center of Ashanti heritage. Beyond the museum, cultural education is embedded in Ashanti life. The Akwesite Festival, held every 6 weeks in the Ashanti calendar, continues to draw thousands. Even beyond Ghana, the Ashanti cultural diaspora remains vibrant. The Ashanti are not a chapter in Ghana's history. Today, Ashanti culture does not resist modernity. It defines it on its own terms. The gold still shines in Ashanti lands, in jewelry, in memory, in the symbols that echo from Kumasi to the world. Even in modern Ghana, gold continues to flow through Ashanti lands just as it did centuries ago. But the industry today is dominated not by kings or artisans, but by corporations. Ashanti Goldfields Corporation, now part of AngloGold Ashanti, is one of the world's largest gold mining companies. Its Obuasi mine, located in the heart of Ashanti territory, has been active for over a century and remains a critical source of Ghana's gold exports. Traditional rulers, civil society groups, and youth leaders are increasingly vocal about ensuring that the gold of today benefits the children of tomorrow, a modern echo of the ancient belief that wealth must serve the people. This industrial mining brings both opportunity and complexity. On one hand, it provides jobs, infrastructure, and foreign investment. On the other, it raises questions of environmental degradation, land rights, and community impact. Schools and youth programs emphasize proverbs, traditional etiquette, dance, and drum language. It is more than ceremony. It is living proof that Ashanti culture still commands reverence. On these days, the king appears in gold-laden splendor, the drums roll, and the people dance not in nostalgia but in continuity. The Ashanti maintain apprenticeship systems for goldsmiths, weavers, and woodcarvers, ensuring that skills passed down through generations do not die with globalization. In London, New York, Toronto, and Amsterdam, Ashanti communities hold festivals, organize royal visits, and teach Twi to children born thousands of miles from Kumasi. They are a living thread woven from the past into the present. Through leadership, education, cultural pride, and global engagement, the Ashanti show that identity is not a relic to be displayed. But the truest wealth of the Ashanti has never been their minerals. It is their spirit, undiminished, undefeated, and unforgettable. It is a torch to be carried forward. Their story, from golden thrones to exiled kings, from resistance wars to global diplomacy, is a testament to Africa's ability to evolve without erasing itself. The Golden Stool may sit in Ghana, but its spirit travels wherever Ashanti hearts beat. Traditional leaders often find themselves mediating between multinational interests and local concerns, balancing the promise of development with the protection of heritage and land. Yet even amid corporate expansion, small-scale gold mining, often called galamsey, persists. Some of it is illegal, some of it artisanal, but all of it is tied to a long memory. In villages near Kumasi, old gold weights are still passed down, not for use, but as heirlooms. The cultural significance of gold remains intact, even as its economic landscape has changed. More importantly, Ashanti communities continue to push for local benefit and accountability. Cultural preservation is not passive, it's intentional. And the Ashanti have become masters of protecting and promoting their legacy. Today, Kumasi is not just a city, it is a living museum where oral tradition, art, and heritage are not frozen in glass cases, but performed daily. Visitors from Ghana and around the world come to learn the story of the empire, to see royal artifacts, and to hear the tale of resistance, glory, and resilience. The museum preserves golden regalia, war drums, stools, and manuscripts, and stands as a proud counter to colonial narratives that once portrayed African kingdoms as primitive or voiceless. The Manhia Palace Museum, located in the restored palace of Asanihin Prempe I, is a major center of Ashanti heritage. Beyond the museum, cultural education is embedded in Ashanti life. The Akweside Festival, held every 6 weeks in the Ashanti calendar, continues to draw thousands. Even beyond Ghana, the Ashanti cultural diaspora remains vibrant. The Ashanti are not a chapter in Ghana's history. Today, Ashanti culture does not resist modernity. It defines it on its own terms. The gold still shines in Ashanti lands, in jewelry, in memory, in the symbols that echo from Kumasi to the world. They came for the gold, but what they found was something they could neither melt down nor carry away: the soul of a people. The Ashanti, renowned for their wealth, did not just build an empire with gold. They built one with memory, meaning, and defiance. Today, centuries after first contact with European powers, the Ashanti legacy shines not just in museums and textbooks, but in movements, symbols, and minds across the globe. Ashanti resistance to empire and their deep-rooted culture of wealth, artistry, and sacred leadership has become more than a national story. It's a global emblem of African pride and perseverance. Much of it was plundered during British military campaigns in the 19th century, particularly after the sack of Kumasi in 1874. In that violent episode, Ashanti palaces were burned, shrines desecrated, and treasures, not just gold, but sacred regalia and royal items, were taken back to London as war trophies. In the polished display halls of the British Museum, the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, Ghanaian leaders, Ashanti royalty, and international activists have called for the return of looted Ashanti artifacts held in European and American museums. During international visits and cultural summits, he has diplomatically but firmly pressed for the repatriation of Ashanti artifacts, including some of the most sacred items removed from Kumasi. France, the UK, Germany, and others have begun grappling with the moral implications of holding onto treasures acquired by force. Some countries have pledged to return specific items. Others have hesitated, citing legal and logistical concerns. These calls are not just about ownership, they're about cultural restoration and historical healing. And other Western institutions, visitors often stop in awe before exhibits labeled Gold of Africa. The Manhia Palace Museum in Kumasi, a restored royal residence, now stands ready to receive and house returned artifacts. They endured in whispers and in song, in fabric and in footsteps. Chief among them is the Golden Stool. It already preserves dozens of original pieces and is a space where Ashanti history is honored, not just studied. Repatriation would not be a return to a vault, but to a living tradition, where gold and regalia are still part of ritual, memory, and identity. Beneath the glass, they find golden necklaces like woven ropes, royal bracelets crafted with unmatched skill, swords with embossed handles, and miniature gold weights shaped like birds, crocodiles, and stools. Filmmakers use Ashanti motifs to represent royalty and power in African-themed epics. Much of this gold comes from one place, the Ashanti Empire. But what many museum placards omit is how those treasures were obtained. Today, these artifacts draw crowds. Researchers publish papers on Ashanti metallurgy and symbolism. Designers cite Ashanti aesthetics as a major influence. Jewelry makers reference Ashanti gold patterns. Yet the admiration often rings hollow because while the world marvels, the people of Ashanti are still separated from many of their sacred treasures. In recent years, the cry for justice has grown louder. One of the most prominent voices has been that of Otumfuo Nana Osei Tutu, the current Assanahene. The campaign echoes broader movements across Africa, from Benin to Ethiopia, seeking the return of heritage stolen during colonial conquest. But the pressure is mounting. Throughout all this, colonization, exile, museum captivity, some symbols never faded. The Golden Stool is not simply a throne. It is the embodiment of the Ashanti nation. It is believed to house the soul of the Ashanti people, living, dead, and yet to be born. Each pattern tells a story. Each color carries meaning: yellow for wealth, green for life, red for sacrifice, black for unity. What began as royal attire in Ashanti palaces is now worn at university graduations in the US, weddings in South Africa, and parliaments across Africa. No king, no invader, no outsider may sit upon it. Not even the Assanahene himself does. To touch it without spiritual authority is unthinkable. Ashanti proverbs, songs, and praise poetry are passed through generations, keeping alive the names of Osei Tutu, Komfo Anokye, and Yaa Asantewaa. Otumfuo Osei Tutu participates in diplomacy, education reform, and cultural preservation. In a world where Africa has too often been spoken for, the Ashanti declare, "We speak for ourselves." In an age that values extraction over meaning, they remind us, gold is not just wealth, it is identity. Under his reign, the Ashanti have become both deeply traditional and outwardly global, a bridge between history and tomorrow. Their story has traveled far, across oceans, through time, and into the hearts of generations. Ashanti culture does not rely on archives. It thrives in living memory, carried in drum rhythms, storytelling sessions, and the wisdom of elders. This stool, hidden and protected through war and colonial arrogance, remains untouched and undefeated, a symbol of resilience so powerful that wars have been fought over its sanctity. But the people who remember, they endure. Then there is kente cloth, woven in vibrant strips of silk and cotton, once worn only by royals, but now a global statement of African dignity. They are a headline in Africa's story of survival. Their story is retold in classrooms, celebrated in art, and invoked in political rhetoric. When Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence in 1957, it was no coincidence that it embraced many Ashanti emblems, including the Black Star of Freedom, the reverence for chiefs, and the celebration of African heritage as strength. Beyond objects, oral tradition remains a fortress. To many in Africa and across the global diaspora, the Ashanti represent what could have been and what still can be. A society that thrived before colonization. A kingdom that matched European statecraft with its own brilliance. A people who resisted domination, not just through war, but through spiritual defiance and cultural confidence. In Black communities worldwide, the Ashanti have become a symbol of African pride. The Ashanti monarchy, still intact and active, stands today not as a relic of feudalism, but as a testament to enduring African leadership. This resilience offers a blueprint to others. In the face of cultural erasure, the Ashanti say, remember, resist, rebuild. The gold of the Ashanti still glimmers, not only in vaults or on museum pedestals, but in the living, breathing strength of a people. They were never a footnote in colonial history. As global conversations continue around reparations, cultural revival, and historical justice, the Ashanti remind the world of this timeless truth. Empires may rise and fall, and as long as the Golden Stool remains unbroken, so too does the spirit of the Ashanti, unbent, undefeated, and unforgettable. Gold made the world take notice. It glittered in the rivers and soil of Ashantiland, seducing traders, kings, and eventually empires. But for the Ashanti people, gold was never merely a measure of wealth. It's about who they were and still are. It was something more sacred, a mirror of the soul, a material charged with memory, identity, and divine power. This story, spanning centuries of brilliance, resistance, and survival, is not just about what the Ashanti had. It was a symbol, not a god. Gold adorned their kings, but never outranked the Golden Stool, which held the soul of the nation. Gold could buy cloth and cattle, but it could not buy loyalty, dignity, or history. Not everything powerful is for sale. We've followed their journey from sacred stools and forest kingdoms through war and colonization to a proud legacy in modern Ghana. And along the way, one truth has stood firm. True wealth is not counted in ounces, but in honor. The Ashanti knew the value of gold. They mined it, traded it, wore it, and sanctified it. But they never worshipped it. They saw profit. The Ashanti saw profanity. Long before maps were redrawn by European powers, the Ashanti were building cities, governing vast territories, conducting diplomacy, crafting philosophy. And their survival is a gift to every young African looking for a reason to walk tall, and shaping one of the most sophisticated cultural systems on the continent. To the post-colonial states still struggling with fractured identities, they offer resilience. And to the world, hungry for models of sustainable culture, leadership, and pride, they offer wisdom. Listen to the drummers speak in tones older than English or French. The colonizers weighed bullion. The Ashanti weighed meaning. From Ashanti to Mali, From Benin to Ethiopia, there are gold-plated stories waiting to be dusted off and reclaimed. It would come in proverb and parable. It would say, when the British came, they came for gold, not just exploited, but exalted. Not just wounded, but wise and worthy. A celebration of what still glows beneath the surface of our world. The Ashanti story is not complete. It is still unfolding, and you are invited to be part of it. We carry the pride of kings who ruled with both sword and ceremony, and of a people who outlasted empire without losing their soul. When they were stripped of their political kingdom, they rebuilt it as a spiritual nation. When their gold was stolen, they held on to something far more precious: memory, tradition, and unity. Advocate for African stories to be told by African voices on African soil. Even as the empire marched in, burned palaces, and carted away treasure, the Ashanti refused to surrender their identity. But what Africa did, what Africa built, kept, and refused to lose. In today's world, where value is so often defined by possession, speed, and spectacle, the Ashanti offer a radical lesson. Not everything valuable is visible. If the Ashanti Empire could speak to the world today, its message would not come in gold coins or trade ledgers. Know your name before others name you. Guard the stories of your people like treasure. Resist not with hate, but with heritage. Do not confuse shine with strength. The Ashanti are proof that African greatness did not begin with colonization, nor does it end with independence. Their endurance is a rebuke to every lie that labeled African civilizations as primitive. To the diasporas scattered by slavery and colonialism, the Ashanti offer roots. We now live in an age where ancient legacies can rise again, not as ghosts of the past, but as tools for the future. Visit Kumasi, walk the grounds of the Manhia Palace, attend an Aqua Side festival, support repatriation efforts, help return what was taken, not just physically, but spiritually. Read the Proverbs, learn the history, teach your children not just what was done to Africa. Celebrate African empires, not just the tragedy of their conquest, but the brilliance of their creation. To explore the Ashanti is to understand that Africa is not a continent of victims, it is a continent of visionaries. As we look ahead, we carry with us the echoes of golden drums, the hush around the Golden Stool, the defiant stare of Yaa Asantewaa, and the wisdom of Komfo Anokye. This is more than history. It's a call to remembrance, a challenge to reclaim. Because in the end, gold may shine, but it is honor that lasts. And the Ashanti, guardians of both, still shine. Thank you for journeying with us through the golden legacy of the Ashanti, a story of riches, resistance, and resilience that still shapes our world today. If this episode sparked something in you, a new perspective, a question, a sense of pride, we'd love to hear from you. We've already explored the wealth of Mali, the mysterious towers of Great Zimbabwe, and the royal power of Nubia, each one offering its own window into Africa's unmatched past. Leave a comment below and join the conversation about Africa's forgotten empires and remembered glory. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you don't miss the rest of our African Empires series. And we're just getting started. In our next documentary, we journey into the Horn of Africa, to the highlands of ancient Ethiopia. From the Battle of Adwa to the unbroken legacy of Haile Selassie, we'll uncover the secrets of the kingdom that still stands. So, share this video with a friend, a teacher, a fellow learner, and help us bring Africa's stories to the center where they belong. Until next time, remember, history isn't just behind us, it's within us.